Girolamo Savonarola, Part 2. Chapter 8. Patriotism of the Friar during the French Invasion. To make clear this episode in Savonarola's career, a brief explanation is necessary of the political complications which occasioned the expedition of Charles VIII of France, an event which, as Machiavelli wrote, ruined Italy and kept her in desolation, and, as Gibbon declared, changed the face of Europe. Of this invasion Villari writes that it proved to be the beginning of the long series of disasters which were to desolate Italy for ages, to destroy her commercial prosperity, to stifle her literary and scientific culture, and to extinguish every spark of her liberty. A benefactor to all Europe, the eyes of Italy's neighbors were turned in eagerness and avarice on this fair domain of culture, wealth, and power. The growing states of Europe were ready, from motives of greed and conquest, from the very spirit of restlessness and brigandage, pervading the royal and noble robbers of those days, to act against weaker powers. Italy was weak because of her divisions. Among the Italian states the lordship of Milan was then held by Ludovico Sforza, surnamed the Moor. This unprincipled man, the guardian of his minor nephew, the rightful Duke of Milan, usurped the place of his charge, imprisoned him, and, is alleged, poisoned him. The young Duke had married the daughter of the King of Naples, who naturally resented the cruel treatment of his daughter and her husband. The anger of this monarch the usurper dreaded, as he also feared the just indignation of other Italian rulers. After attempting various schemes, he resolved to secure for himself a powerful ally by urging Charles of Anjou, King of France, to come to Italy and claim, though on a baseless title, the Neapolitan throne. Charles came with 60,000 men, and calamity followed his march. Savonarola saw in the French monarch another Cyrus, an instrument of justice and of punishment. Respecting Florence, however, events took a turn most embarrassing and disadvantageous to the Republic. The party opposed to Piero desired the coming of the king, in the hope that the Medici might be expelled. Piero adopted a policy of opposition to Charles, but failed to sustain it by any decided action. He excited the king's anger, and then foolishly hastened to put himself in Charles' power by surrendering, without any compensation, 3 of Tuscany's most important fortresses. He also promised, in return for the royal protection, to raise a large sum of money for Charles. These actions angered the Florentines. As a visitor passing through their territory, they would have welcomed the French monarch, but his coming as an enemy that would not be placated even by Piero's surrender of their fortresses and promised gift of money terrified them. At this juncture, while the French king was yet distant from the city, Florentine ambassadors followed Piero, hoping to make honorable terms with Charles, but he put them off with vain words. These events occurred early in November. The French were then on the Florentine territory, and by the force of their numbers and military equipment, Tuscany lay helpless before them. In the meantime, the tidings of their advance had reached Florence, where a scene of disorder and riotous murder would have been the natural result among an enraged people who believed that they had been betrayed by their incompetent and cowardly first citizen. At this moment of extreme peril, Savonarola was the one man to whom all the citizens looked. While the Signory held council with men of repute and patriotism, the prior ascended the pulpit of the Duomo. His spirit seemed to penetrate the vast assembly as he stretched over them his hands, and solemnly announced to them that the time had come for repentance, now that his prophecies were fulfilled. Over hearts seething with anger and vengeance, over minds devising ways and means of executing the speedy justice on the Medici, God's grace and light fell through the preacher's marvelous discourse, and the mighty throng went out from the Duomo, filled with a spirit of forgiveness towards their enemies and with the patient courage that marks true patriotism. Savonarola had saved Florence from scenes of blood and rapine. The work of the signatory was thus rendered comparatively easy. Instead of a revolutionary mob, they found a practically united people, ready to face the difficulties and dangers that threatened. Though preparing for defense, the Florentines deemed it advisable to send another embassy to Charles. Of this body Savonarola was a member. He did not, however, accompany the citizens who had been commissioned with him, but following them in the company of some of his brethren, he went out to meet the French king, who was encamped at Pisa. During Savonarola's absence on this embassy, the indignant Florentines expelled Piero de' Medici, who had returned to the city, and his brother, the cardinal, afterwards Leo X. The lay ambassadors accomplished little with the French. Charles would make no promises beyond a general declaration that all would be arranged after his entrance into the city. On the arrival of Savonarola, of whose prophecies concerned himself Charles had heard, the monarch granted speedy audience to the friar. The accounts of this interview differ in details, but on essential points the historians are agreed. It was a picturesque scene. Savonarola spoke fearlessly, telling the most Christian king that, as the messenger of God, he greeted him who came as the instrument of God, to punish the guilty and protect the innocent. Nevertheless, he continued, hearken to the warning of God's unworthy servant. For the sake of the many just and virtuous who are in Florence, spare that city. Reform the abuses which afflict God's church. If these things are done, thy kingdom will be increased. But if thou dost neglect the work which the Lord hath called thee to do, another will be set in thy place, and his wrath will scourge thee. These things I declare to thee in the name of the Lord. The king did not commit himself, though seemingly moved by Savonarola's address. The latter returned to Florence, bringing comfort to the people even by his presence, though he bore messages scarcely more satisfactory than those of the other ambassadors. Charles would arrange no terms for an understanding or treaty with the Florentines until he had passed through their gates. On November 17th, many of his officers having previously arrived, the French monarch was received with pomp by the Signory, who had provided for him and his immediate suite in the splendid Medici palace. The visit lasted 10 days, and during this time Charles proved himself to be as troublesome as well as a dishonest guest. Previous to the ratification of the treaty, which had been the occasion of much dispute, The arrogant monarch showed a disposition to act harshly, threatening even to sack the city. Again were Savonarola's efforts successful among the people for the preservation of peace and for the avoidance of strife or collision with the foreign troops who were scattered through the city. Once more he brought his personal influence to bear directly on the king. Having sought the royal presence, without introduction or hesitation, he bluntly told Charles that his Majesty's stay was causing great injury to the people in the city, as well as to the work which God had imposed on him, reproaching him for losing valuable time. He urged Charles to pursue his journey without further delay, or his worldly fame, as well as his spiritual interests, would suffer. He concluded by threatening the king with the wrath of God if he inflicted any injury on the city. These brave words had their desired effect. Charles resumed his march, carrying with him, however, despite the generous treatment he had received, many art treasures that had been collected by the Medici. As the royal plunderer had numerous imitators among officers and soldiers, it is not surprising that the indignation and hatred of the Florentines followed the French army on its way to Naples. 9. The friar's services to the Florentine Republic, 1494 to 1495. If Savonarola's services to the Florentines had been of inestimable value during the troublous days of the French visit, when the grateful love of the people had proudly proclaimed their debt to the prior, the assistance he rendered subsequently was not of less importance. Great confusion prevailed, in consequence of the expulsion of Piero de Medici, whose reign in the Republic closed 60 years of Medicean rule, under which the foundations of liberty had been destroyed, a mere semblance of liberty having been preserved by the continuance of certain forms and names, from which all spirit and living meaning had departed. A strong government was needed, and the friends of Florentine freedom realized that vigorous measures must be adopted. Among a people of high temper and ardent spirit, passing through such a crisis, there was special need of a prudent and clear-sighted leader. Savonarola did not assume that post. Events determined it for him. Many looked to him as the man of the hour, providentially set for a great work. He was not only faithful to expectations that had been aroused, but by his sermons, his entreaties to the rich to be generous, to the poor to be patient, to employers to provide opportunities for labor, to all to practice mutual charity, to be faithful in prayer and piety. He established the temporary empire of religion over Florence, and wonderfully smoothed the way for political reconstruction, in which, as yet, he had taken no direct part. But as Villari well says, the hour had struck for his appearance in the arena of politics, and notwithstanding the firm determination of which he had hitherto held aloof from it, he was now compelled to obey the summons by the pressure of events. The appearance of Savonarola in the political arena as the champion of liberty is an event significant in itself, though the history of Florence and Italian history in general furnish many notable instances of saintly men and even women who entered into public life of their day for the betterment of civil affairs. On 2 points his most severe critics must render homage to the truth. 1. Savonarola was a preacher, a religious, a priest of holiness beyond dispute, waiving his relations with Alexander VI. 2. Savonarola was the moral and political regenerator of Florence. Disinterested, unselfish, his big brave heart was filled with love for the people, with solicitude for the welfare of the poor, with zeal for the salvation of souls. No thought of winning political power was his. He simply used the rich gifts which God had endowed him, as he felt divinely urged, to speak and act for the people. On the third Sunday of Advent, 1494, his sermon indicated the trend of his thoughts on affairs of state. He laid the foundation deep in religion, the love of God, mercy and charity towards all, forgiveness of enemies, forgetfulness of past injuries and wrongs, and pardon and restoration of those who had been identified with Piero. He pleaded for such a government as would best assure the interest of all, and the best serve the welfare of the public as against that of individuals. He urged a rectification of taxes, a more equable distribution of those burdens among the rich and poor. Finally, he recommended the formation of a grand council, after the manner of the Venetians. Within 2 weeks, the political measures which he had outlined were carried into effect. Out of a helpless, almost chaotic condition, the friar had evolved order. He had suppressed civil rebellion, and held in check a most excitable people. To lawyers and men versed in politics he gave such a lesson in statecraft that all were amazed at his practical knowledge of public affairs. Only one measure that he recommended was doomed to failure. He urged the formation of a select court of last resort as a check on the arbitrary power of the bench of judges, who were known as the Eight. Savonarola's wise suggestion was not adopted. The court was not established. Though the right of appeal was admitted to the Grand Council, a body numbering several thousand. Though only 1/3 of this body acted at a time, and for a given period, it was too unwieldy for the delicate and deliberative responsibilities contemplated by Savonarola. He recommended the establishment of the Monte di Pieta for temporary relief of the deserving poor by loans of moderate interest, thus freeing thousands from the clutches of the usurers, whose system of compounding interest was a legalized method of robbery. During the closing days of 1494, the Republic was re-established, the result being largely the achievement of the prior, to whom nearly all had turned in their hour of peril. The work was rapidly developed. By the end of 1495, the people enjoyed liberty to such a degree that the government never more truly deserved the name of republic. The city had been transformed. Indeed, Savonarola had proclaimed from the pulpit the freedom of the children of God, under the kingship of Jesus Christ over all hearts, and in a sense it may be said that he established a theocracy in the city where pagan ideas and manners had so lately reigned. Vice no longer stalked unrebuked in the street. Rather had the reign of virtue been inaugurated. Were the secret excesses diminished? Should youth be denied moderate amusements? These questions conservative men put to one another in Savonarola's day. It is to be feared that the city passed too rapidly from one extreme to the other. and that Savonarola encouraged among an unprepared multitude the application of principles in details available only for the cloister. 10. The friar saves Florence from the French king. During 1495, Savonarola was unflagging in the work of preaching. At the beginning of the year, a serious difficulty confronted him through the machinations of the Arrabbiati. These men sought the downfall of the Republic, in the hope of erecting on its ruins an aristocracy or oligarchy. Through their misrepresentations, the Pope was induced to order Savonarola to proceed to Lucca. The prior made ready to leave, but the Signory, and many others, by most urgent letters, prevailed upon His Holiness to reconsider his command. Savonarola remained in Florence. Before the opening of his regular Lenten course, he preached several sermons, one of notable force and vehemence, in which ecclesiastical disorders and sins of princes were unsparingly rebuked. The publication of this discourse, known as the Renewal Sermon, was an occasion of bitter strife. His followers hailed it with delight. The Arrabbiati circulated it for the harm that they hoped would bring on the preacher, through the animosity of those in high places against whom he had so strongly spoken. How far this incident influenced the tone of Savonarola's discourse during Lent we know not, but a sadness and gloom pervaded them. He frequently referred to the violent death that he had already seemed clearly to foresee. Another event that sorely tried Savonarola's soul was the attempt made by his enemy, the Gonfalonieri Corbizi, to have him condemned for interference in affairs of state. For this purpose Corbizi summoned a council of theologians to the palace. Among them was a decided opponent of Savonarola, in fact, his most obstinate assailant, a Dominican named Thomas of Rieti, a member of the community of Santa Maria Novella. Having heard the charges, Savonarola, to whom the purpose of the meeting had not previously been known, for he was accustomed to preach occasionally before the Signory, made a noble answer, first sharply scoring his Dominican opponent, and then completely confounding the others by his dexterous defense. Most Christian sire, it is the Lord's will that the Florentines should continue their alliance with your majesty, but he wishes your protection to extend the freedom of the people, not of any individual, for God has ordained the fall of all tyrants. The Lord will inflict terrible punishment on any private citizen who seeks to usurp, as in the past, the government of this flourishing republic, which has been constituted not by man, but by God. He has chosen this city to increase it. He has filled it with his servants. Whosoever touches it touches the apple of his eye. Therefore, sire, if you will not obey him by keeping your pledges to the Florentines and restoring their fortresses, many calamities will come upon you, and the nations will rise against you. In a few days Savonarola followed this letter by going out to Poggibonsi, whither the king had advanced. Again he spoke as the messenger of God, boldly telling Charles that his disobedience to God was the cause of his failure and losses. Savonarola further declared that the king had provoked the divine anger by his treachery to the Florentines, and by his refusal to effect the reforms for which God had called him. He concluded his address by warning him for the last time that, if he did not earnestly take up the work of God, still greater calamities would come upon him, and God would reject him. Charles no further annoyed the city of Florence. His ill-concealed friendliness for the Pisans, then in revolt against Florence, and his retention of the fortresses which Piero had so pusillanimously surrendered to him, occasioned, however, heavy loss and trouble to the Republic, while his encouragement of Piero emboldened the expelled prince to attempt a forcible entrance of the city. This attempt failed, but it occasioned a manifestation of patriotism and courage on the part of the Florentines and their spiritual leader, deserving the highest praise. Savonarola's sermons at this time, October, were marked by a vigor and a fire that some have considered excessive. But they do not justly weigh his words who separate them from the conditions and dangers out of which they sprang. As a true patriot, Savonarola spoke. "12. Relations with the Pope, 1495. To the opinion of certain writers that Florence's opposition to the League of Italian States, of which the Pope was a member, irritated and angered Alexander VI against Savonarola, we ought not to attach undue importance. Admitting that the friar's political attitude was offensive to the Pope, other circumstances were conspiring to draw the pontiff's attention to the preacher. His sermons, in which ecclesiastical abuses were unsparingly lashed, were reported, perhaps in an exaggerated form, and were sent to Rome, with inflammatory letters from his persistent enemies in Florence. The sovereign pontiff was obliged to take notice of a man who had made powerful enemies among prelates of high rank, and who had become the storm center, politically and ecclesiastically, of the day. The following letter was dispatched to the prior of St. Mark's by Alexander on July 25, 1495. Beloved son, health and apostolic blessing. Amongst the many who have labored in the vineyard of the Lord, we have learned from several sources that your labors have been especially earnest and successful. This fills up with deep joy and gratitude to God, who so powerfully works among us by his grace. Nor do we doubt but that you are an instrument in his hands for the abundant sowing of his divine word, and the reaping of a plentiful harvest. Moreover, recent letters on this very subject have given us to understand that in all your sermons you instruct the people in the service of God, and that you announce future events, being moved thereto, not by human learning or wisdom, but by the Spirit of God. Being desirous, therefore, as is our duty, of conferring with you on these matters, and so learning God's will more clearly, we wish you to come to us as soon as possible, and we give you a command in virtue of holy obedience to that effect. We shall greet you with all fatherly tenderness and love." Recalling what travel meant in those days, and considering the necessary slowness and uncertainty of mail delivery, we can understand that there may have been no needless delay in Savonarola's answer, which is dated July 31st. Most Holy Father, I prostrate myself at the feet of your holiness. Although I am aware that we must always obey the commands of our superiors, since we read in Holy Writ that he heareth you, heareth me. Still it is their meaning and not merely their words that we have to obey. And because I have long desired to visit Rome and to worship at the shrine of the apostles, to venerate the relics of so many saints, and to see your holiness, these ardent longings have greatly increased since I received the letter of your holiness, deigning to invite one so unworthy to your presence. But as there are many difficulties in the way, I shall humbly lay them before your holiness, so that you may see the reasonableness of my excuses, and that it is necessity and not unwillingness which prevents me from obeying the command which I received with the deepest love and reverence. In the first place, there is the delicate state of my health, the result of fever and other sicknesses which I have had of late. Then my position here, especially during the last year, has entailed on me such a continual strain of mind and body that I am exceedingly weak, utterly unable to undertake any work, or to bear the least fatigue. The physicians have obliged me to give up all study and preaching, for, in their opinion and that of many friends, I shall endanger my life unless I once submit to proper treatment. Moreover, since Almighty God had made use of me to deliver this city from bloodshed and other serious evils, and to establish peace with respect for law, I have made as many enemies as there are wicked men in this place. For whether they are citizens or strangers, they vented their rage on me when they saw their love for fighting, their ambition, and their greedy thoughts of rapine and plunder frustrated. At the present moment their plots against my life, either by open assassination or secret poisoning, are so frequent that I cannot leave the house without guards. Indeed, when I went to confer with the French king, the loyal Florentines would not allow me to pass out of their protection, although I was furnished with a safe conduct. Although I trust in God, I must not despise ordinary precautions, lest I should seem to tempt him, since it is written, "When they persecute you in one city, flee into another." Moreover, the recent improvement in this city which God's grace had effected is hardly sufficient established to withstand the persistent efforts of the wicked, and needs daily care and attention. Since, therefore, my departure at the present moment would, in the opinion of earnest and prudent men, cause difficulties among the people and help the plots of the Medician faction, it is evidently not God's will that I should leave here at present. I hope it will be soon, and if, perhaps, your holiness wishes to know more about the misfortunes of Italy and the renovation of the church, of which I have publicly spoken, it is all fully treated in a book which I am now having printed, and which, as soon as it is ready, I shall send to your holiness. From it you will be able to gather all you wish to hear. I have said nothing that is not there. I have only delivered the message entrusted to me. To go beyond that, and to attempt to read the unknown secrets of God, would be sinful. I have had these things printed, that all may know if I have been deceived or deceiving. But if things happen, as I have said, then let them thank our Lord and Savior, who by his loving care of us shows that he wishes no one to perish eternally. Therefore, I ask your holiness to accept these my excuses as most true and valid, and to believe that nothing would give me greater joy than to be able to carry out your commands. I need no other spur than my own desire to urge me to conquer these difficulties as soon as I can, and to satisfy the wishes of your holiness, to whom I commend myself in all humility. The tenor of the Pope's letter is indulgent, benign, and gentle. Villari contends that the brief was issued in a spirit of deceit to entrap Savonarola, but he offers no proof. Rather are the circumstances and the evidence against this aspersion of the Pope's motives. Savonarola's old antagonist, Mariano, was at that time in Rome, and Villari contends that his rabid and calumnious discourses had embittered Alexander. We are of the opinion that His Holiness had weightier cares than listening to the complaints and dissensions of friars. Villari also maintains that the Arrabbiati were plotting against Savonarola, and that a journey to Rome at this time, literally among thieves and murderers, might have been attended by assassination along the way, or by lifelong imprisonment at the end. With this conclusion we cannot entirely agree. Moreover, we may not interpret the mind of the Pope beyond his written words, and they are fatherly. The politics probably entered into the question, but the command of the Pope was the supreme law for Savonarola. However, as Alexander had set no time for his visit to Rome, and as commands are amenable to a reasonable construction when their terms are vague, the friar's prompt excuses expressed in the respectful language which we have quoted may have been justified. Previously answering the pontiff's letter, Savonarola announced his withdrawal from the pulpit on account of his illness, the shattered state of his health, and the exhaustion evident to all. To the casual reader, Savonarola's letter suggests a want of frankness, together with an assumption of judgment, scarcely compatible with that obedience which is due to a superior. On this point we remark that some authors deem this letter justified by Savonarola's intense conviction, not only from certain conscience, the rule of morals, but from the heavenly light which he believed had been vouchsafed to him, and which he interpreted as imposing an imperative duty upon him. With this view we cannot coincide. Even admitting such an interpretation, it would show, on Savonarola's part, excessive zeal, for which there may be palliation, but not entire justification, even under the extraordinary trying circumstances attending Savonarola's difficulty with the Pope. Still we hold that his spirit was of obedience, and the tacit acceptance of his excuses by Alexander would indicate that the pontiff did not then consider the friar wanting in submission. His closing discourse at the end of July he called a terrible sermon. Yet, as was his wont, it was stamped with the spirit of tenderness for the people and gentleness toward sinners, a spirit that went out even to the hated Jews, at a time when other ecclesiastics had demanded severe measures against them. Verily, broken in health, Savonarola retired to St. Mark's, and Father Dominic of Pescia, his faithful disciple, took his place in the pulpit of the Duomo. Scarcely 6 weeks had elapsed when a second brief was issued by the Pope. Though intended for Savonarola and St. Mark's, this brief was addressed to the friars of the Holy Cross Church who had been opponents of the Dominicans. It referred to the prior of St. Mark's as a certain friar Jerome, a seeker after novelty and a disseminator of false doctrines, claiming to have a divine mission, but without proof of Holy Writ or miracles. The brief then branched off on the subject of the Lombard jurisdiction, the separation from which Alexander himself had authorized for St. Mark's. Branding as scandalous the position held by Savonarola and the Brethren of St. Mark's, several of whom were summarily ordered to Bologna. Savonarola was directed to show himself subject to the superior of the Lombard congregation, and to hold himself ready for a summons by that prelate, to whom, though a party to the previously settled dispute, the affair was now referred for final judgment. We may pass over the circumstance that the brief was addressed to another community, on the supposition that this would guarantee publicity, though no action or word of Savonarola or his brethren had as yet given any occasion for holding them under the suspicion that they would suppress the brief. The reference to a certain friar Jerome in the face of Alexander's previous personal letter to him is puzzling. It may have been the work of one of the Pope's secretaries. The charge of false doctrine was subsequently stamped as false, even in Alexander's day, and, more emphatically, by one of his successors. The sudden interjection of a question of jurisdiction between two provinces of the order, a matter which Alexander himself had decided, and to which his former letter he made no reference, suggests to Villari a religious pretext for picking a political quarrel. But the inference is not clear. Savonarola was in a sore dilemma. On either horn he might be impaled. That he was grievously troubled and yet seemingly unshaken in the sense of religious duty, we gather from a letter addressed by him to one of the Dominicans in Rome. All the world knows that the charges against me are false. My accusers have no cause for attack. Rather they stone me for a good deed. But I neither dread them nor fear their power, for I rely on the grace of God and an upright conscience. I know who are the real authors of these troubles. They are wicked citizens who desire to raise themselves to power, and their accomplices are wicked princes of Italy. They all wish to rid themselves of my presence here at any cost, since they consider me an obstacle to their ambition. In fact, I dare not leave the convent without an escort. If His Holiness knew all, I do not think that he would wish me to go to Rome. I will obey, however, even though my obedience should bring about the ruin of the world. For I would not sin, even venially, in this affair. Comment on these sentiments would be superfluous. In his answer to the Pope, sent towards the end of the same month, he respectfully defended his doctrines, denied that he had ever claimed absolutely to be a prophet, reminded Alexander how the separation of St. Mark's from the Lombard jurisdiction had been effected on the appeal of the entire community, submitted all his writings to the judgment of the Holy See, and declared his prompt readiness to accept the correction and guidance of the Church. To this letter Alexander replied on the 16th of October, though Savonarola did not receive the papal brief for several weeks. In this communication Alexander praised the obedience of Savonarola, admitted his good intentions, but commanded him to desist from further preaching till he would be able, with honor and safety, to make the journey to Rome. Savonarola complied with this injunction against his preaching, Father Dominic taking his place in the cathedral during the succeeding Advent. 13. Reformation of the Children of Florence, 495 to 1496. The closing days of 1495 found Savonarola in retirement, but active with his pen. Though enfeebled in health, his mind had lost none of its clearness, nor was his high spirit daunted. Sharing the opinion held by many of the cardinals, as well as by a large number of bishops, priests, and laymen, who were zealous for the honor of religion, Savonarola longed for the assembling of a council. He wrote to Charles of France, urging this hesitating monarch to take steps towards the desired end. He also engaged in other correspondence, but always bearing on the spiritual life. The time for the Carnival of 1496 was approaching, and it was evident that the Arrabbiati were determined to restore the abominable features which had prevailed in the Medicean days. Savonarola resolved to prevent this, though he knew full well the disposition of the people and the readiness with which they could be swayed back to the sins they had abandoned. Their conversion was not lasting, rather had a passing emotional, momentarily changed in them. Knowing this, he would not have surprised by any outburst of wickedness among those who had been swayed only by that peaceful voice, now no longer ringing out the threats of divine justice, or gently urging the pleadings of divine mercy. He began his campaign with the boys. He inaugurated the reform of the children. In this work we find a most interesting phase of Savonarola's mission. For generations the Florentines had been accustomed to revelry and even debauchery, especially under the de' Medici. During carnival holidays, the boys took part in the celebration in a way characteristic of youthful heedlessness and even of cruelty. A game they played at this time was known as that of the stones, a brutal and occasionally a fatal pastime which closed the day's festivities. After having secured means for a supper by intercepting the people on the street, whose passage they would not allow except on the payment of money, the evening was spent around a huge bonfire. At this time they found entertainment in pelting one another with stones. Against these disorderly customs, warnings, threats, penalties had proved ineffective. The great preacher, silenced, deprived of the privilege of exercising his marvelous God-given power in the pulpit, took to heart the case of the children whose improvement was not beneath the efforts of the man who had politically and morally reformed their elders. And his success was pronounced. Catering to the military and political instinct that is quick in the heart of every real boy, Savonarola marshaled the Florentine youth, the same wild, lovable fellows in the 15th century that we find in the 19th, according to the quarters of the city, and had them elect their own captains, with counselors for the captains. Thus organized, he exhorted them to make a new carnival. For the shameful songs that they had sung, they would not sing the new songs. He himself would write them, and fitting music would also be provided. He seemed to hear the honest-hearted boys, who felt that the great prior was their true friend, as they promised to sing his hymns. The worn preacher kindled again the poetic fires of other days, and forgetting the triumphs of the Duomo, burying in his own great heart his sorrows and his wrongs, wrote for the lads sweet hymns and pure songs, whose sacred melody would rise to heaven in reparation for the shameful ballads of Medicean days. He allowed the boys to beg, but not offensively, not to the intercepting of any passer-by. From house to house they went, and when at night they had gathered a rich harvest, it was turned over to the good men of St. Martin, for the modest and deserving poor. Beyond doubt the generous and tender-hearted prior made ample provision for a big supper for his Florentine boys. Here we may anticipate to mention Savonarola's special solicitude for the children during the Lent of 1496, when he arranged a novel and most interesting procession on Palm Sunday. His success with the boys during the carnival assured his further success in the Palm Sunday celebration. The Monte di Pieta, which we have already referred, had been for some time in operation. Desirous of assisting still further in this meritorious work, he instituted a procession of the children, who visited all the churches, sang hymns, collected alms, and, at the close, made a handsome offering to their pious work. And so much joy was there in all hearts, says Berlamacci, that the glory of paradise seems to have descended on earth, and many tears of tenderness and devotion were shed. Who can wonder that under the impulse of these extraordinary changes, the Florentines cried out, "Live Jesus Christ, our King!"